Okay, I think we're live. All right, I think we are live now. Hello, everyone. Joanna here, and welcome to Why Read episode 29. Today I have Abby Salter and Hannah Blackwell. So, very excited
Hi.
to talk to you two. Hello. And so today we're going to start every episode. We always start every episode with the same exact question. And that question is, why read, which is the name of the show. So this question is not necessarily like a fantasy origin or a fantasy reading origin question. It's not necessarily what made you inspired to pick up books in the first place, though you can take it that direction if you'd like to. It's more what inspires you right now in this busy life with so many distractions, with so many things competing for your attention, so many hobbies, and I'm sure I might ask you, Hannah, about your crafting at some point, but with so many different pastimes, what inspires you to pick up a book? And there is no right answer to this question. It's not a quiz, I promise. So we'll go ahead and start with Abby. Abby, what inspires you to pick up a book?
I was thinking about this earlier today. I was like, I need to come up with an answer for this question. And then I was like, I still don't have an answer. So I feel as though I don't know life without reading, that I have always been a reader. And it's always been a big part of my personality. Even in my baby book, one of my first words was book. So it's quite, I feel like it's hard to separate myself from it in a way. And I think one of the reasons why I keep coming back to it and coming back to this form of media, because I do watch TV, but not a lot. And I don't gravitate towards TV and film as much as I gravitate towards reading. I think some of it is the escapism, being able to like escape into a book and that world and being able to sort of see the world through different people's eyes and being able to explore, because most of what I read is fantasy, that fantastical landscape and the magic, and just try to envision myself having those magical powers and going through those adventures. But yes, also sort of seeing different people's perspectives and points of view and learning from it as well, that there's two sides. There's the escape and the what I can learn from it, and the feeling after reading a book of like, I don't know, satisfaction, joy, and that I don't get that from other forms of media. Like I don't finish watching a TV show and go, oh, that was a great use of my time. Whereas reading, I sort of feel that fulfillment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm remembering now a long time ago, back in the day, that you did a wonderful video on escapism.
Yeah.
Remembering that now. Yeah. Yeah. And also I think what's interesting too, because I know this about you too, Abby, is that unlike a lot of people like myself, for example, who have gone through years at a time, like maybe while in college, going through a time where you didn't read much fiction or, focused on other things, maybe focused on your studies. You never went through a phase like that, right?
I mean,
Like you've been
I think there was times in school where I didn't read as much, where I would, be a bit more haphazard. And I think that's when I didn't know so much of the literature that was out there, that I'd go, okay, I've been presented with Twilight and the Hunger Games, and I'd binge them, and then I wouldn't really know where to go next. So then I'd just reread those things that I'd discovered. And so it would be more haphazard. And then it got to like 2014-ish, and then I really became a very, very avid reader again.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so maybe just a little bit, but not as much, I think, compared to a lot of us. So I think that's amazing. Very special about your journey. And Hannah, what about you? What inspires you to pick up a book? Why read?
So I guess I could go a number of ways with this, obviously. And I've watched a few of these episodes, and they're just really cool. And so many people have had so many amazing answers to this. I think I'll talk about just like why, like it right now, like on my day-to-day life, why do I pick up a book? Which I think is like what you're asking anyway, but like I I so in this last year, I was diagnosed with ADHD, and I was having trouble getting things done, and I had been reading for a little bit. I started my YouTube channel like 2 years ago. I'd started reading again as an adult maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, and I discovered that it really kind of helps me reward myself. So I kind of use it in order to get things done. Like if I have things I don't want to do, I'll use it to get through those tasks via an audiobook, or I'll use it as a reward for tasks. And I'll use the community also as a reward too. But it's an escapism, like Abby said, and so that creates the reward in and of itself. There's so many reasons, but I feel like it really helps with my mental health, to be able to get out and away from technology and the distractions of my little ones. Like I've got a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and just all the distractions and everything, on the news, wherever it is, all of my to-dos, and my responsibilities, whatever it is, cooking, the garden, keeping up with the house, homeschooling the kids, it it gives me that reward and that escape, and it kind of helps to balance out my mental health.
That
Um
is so sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah, no, I love that because one, I find it really interesting, and thank you so much for opening up to us and sharing about your ADHD struggles. It sounds to me like what I'm gathering from your answer is it sounds to me like there are a lot of things that can be for your attention, as I suggested in the initial question. A lot of things like family and things in our world, several things that are kind of stressful sometimes too. And it sounds to me like maybe reading provides you a place where you can ground in and focus. Would you say that's accurate?
yeah, it kind of gives me a pause and a timeout. Um from things that can be grabbing my attention that I don't want to be, but are. But then at the same time, it gives me the timeout and pause reward, like after tasks. Or on the reverse side, if I need the distraction during a task I don't want to do. So I use it as a tool.
I find it interesting how there are some people that, when things are really, really stressful, can read and will dive into reading as a way to escape from it. But then there are some people that, when they're really stressed, they can't read because they can't get into reading and escapism because they're so focused on what's stressing them out.
Right.
Yeah. No, I
I'm
totally
one of
agree
those
with
people that
you.
when I'm sad or stressed, I like to read. So, like, if my mental health, like, generally, if there are issues going on, I will turn to my reading to improve my mental health, and you'll see a month where I read, like, 20 to 30 books, and then my mental health is much better by the end of that month. You know what I'm saying? It
Mhm.
helps get me out of it.
Interesting. Yeah. So I find that interesting too because it's the same thing like what you were saying just now. I've noticed that almost there are a lot of people in our community who do find the reward find that when they're stressed, reading is a go-to to feel more calm, to feel more centered, to feel better. It's the reward, as you were saying, Hannah. And I think it can be, but for me, sometimes when I'm stressed, or it just depends. I know I was asked in a recent video over on a channel about mental health and about if I'm going through a rough patch with mental health, what kind of book I would turn to or an experience I had where I turned to a book during a mental health episode. And for me, I've noticed that whenever I've gone through any sort of upheaval in my life, like actually, I don't really want to read that much. I actually find I don't go towards it. So, kind of what you were saying, Abby, like some people tend to go towards the reading when they're stressed or when they're going through something. And then some people, like me, I think, don't really feel like I can focus on reading when I'm going through an episode. So that's just really
Because it's
interesting.
definitely a hobby that requires engagement more so than watching something that you have to put more physical or more effort into it.
Yeah.
I do find too with that because of what you were saying, Abby, with the engagement aspect, when I am feeling like down, depressed, or just kind of all over the place, sometimes I hit kind of like an ADHD burnout period, and that can lead to depression period. And it's during that ADHD burnout when I'm so, at this point, so distracted by everything that I often will turn to books that don't require thinking.
Mm.
So that's when I read like a lot of more of my like Kindle Unlimited romance books, and I read probably like 60% of what I read is probably romance. And I don't tend to read like a horror or epic fantasy or sci-fi when I need that from my reading. I tend to read like alien romance or something like that.
Yeah, and it's good that you have those options too, have the different genre options, which I'm gonna ask both of you I would love to ask both of you about since I know both of you read both of you read for romance, but then also epic fantasy, and I know, Hannah, you were talking about sci-fi. I'm just gonna go ahead and read a couple of comments in the chat though first. Krista says, "When I'm stressed and sad, I can doom scroll, and then I beat myself for doom scrolling," which is such a challenge. I know that there's often the advice given that if you want to be a reader, maybe put your phone in a separate room. But honestly, it really is an easy thing to just find yourself doing without even thinking about it. So I can understand that very well. And then Anita says that's very interesting. I can't focus when I'm struggling with struggling mental health wise. I'm the same way, Anita. Uh, and then Evie is reorganizing her shelves while listening to us. Happily ever, April says, I use reading to wind down and relax my brain. It's my self care time. I love all these answers and like just the different sides to this thought about reading and its place in our mental health because I was watching a video today where the person was saying that when it comes to mental health or when it comes to self-care, it's not self-care unless I'm sorry, I don't remember the video person's name who said this, but she said it's not self-care unless it feels good. Like if you're practicing self-care, it should be something that feels good. So I think that makes sense because a lot of times if we're trying to shut down and we're just doom scrolling, we're probably not feeling good, or if we're just watching something to escape everything, but we're not feeling good, then it's probably not really helping our health or sorry, our mental health. But if we are reading and enjoying what we're reading, then I could see that being a way of
I think
finding
like I'll always feel fulfilled once I finish reading. Like it gives me it fills me up, whereas I don't get that from doom scrolling.
Yes.
There's
Yes.
the dopamine hit of finishing an accomplishment.
That is
Yeah.
a big thing, isn't it? Mhm. Yeah. I try to be careful about that, like, not read just to check a book off a list, but I can't deny that there is something about that too. There is something fulfilling about that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Matt says, "I get the same thing from reading that I get from a good song or painting." And I think that's fair too. I think it's good to have there are various ways that we can find fulfillment and find enjoyment that are not just reading. I know we as readers tend to, sing about reading all the time about how great it is, but there are other great things as well. Hello, Evie. Yeah. So I guess another thing I wanted to say is that I brought these two channels together. I always try to find a good fit on why I read. And like I said, I've noticed both Abby Salter and Hannah Blackwell. Well, one, they both know each other and they've been on streams together before. Is that right?
Yeah.
You've been on streams together?
Mm-hmm. She actually co-hosted two? Was it two or three of the
A couple
readathon?
of readathons, yeah.
Yeah, for when I was doing Once Upon a Readathon.
Cool. Tell us about that readathon, by the way.
It's a readathon that I've done 3 times, and it's retelling inspired, like fairy tale retelling inspired readathon. And it's set in a world that I made up called Miriana, and that's where I had set my original TBR game that I played that I don't play anymore. But I had a board game that I made, and it was set in Miriana, and so that's where the readathon took place. And I wrote a fairy tale for the first 2 readathons. I wrote a fairy tale for, and to kind of give you a backstory of like where everyone was starting. And it's like team based and competitive. And then the third one, the most recent one, which was a winter one, I think I assigned each team a fairy tale that was already pre-made. Not pre, you know what I'm saying? Like an original, like Grimm's fairy tale kind of thing. But yeah.
Oh, that sounds fun. I love that you built your own world. Sounds so
I
creative.
didn't go super in depth. But I did, when I did have Patreon, I did like make a map of it. And the Patreon was Mariana too. But I stopped doing Patreon because I don't got the time.
Yeah, it's a lot of time, I understand. I don't have a Patreon myself, but I understand it's quite the commitment. So, yeah. Um, so I'm curious too about so you chose fairy tale retellings. Do you find that's maybe your favorite type of fantasy, or is it just a type of fantasy you enjoy a lot?
I would say, I think Abby and me are both very similar in this. We both have very similar taste in like historical fantasy that is like a retelling, right, Abby?
I'd say I enjoy that. Like,
Yeah, like Juliette Marillier,
Yeah.
that like
Mhm.
Naomi Novik, um, Catherine Arden, these like slower, atmospheric, like fairy tale retellings that are often
foresty.
historical. Huh?
Foresty.
Foresty.
Foresty, yes,
Yeah.
foresty. I love forest settings. And it's definitely one of my favorite genres. When I look at like my favorite books of all time, I would say there's at least a few of them are retellings.
Yeah, so, I was also noticing, speaking of Juliette Marillier, Abby, you were saying, I think, in one of your recent videos about how you were loving one of her series, and it's not the one with Daughter of the Forest. I cannot remember the name of the book. Can you remind me?
Dreamer's Pool.
Yeah.
So I read the whole trilogy this year and I really enjoyed it.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And
So
it was so funny because I was on Abby for a while to read Blackthorn and Grimm, and which is the trilogy, but
Oh,
Dreamer's Pool. And then she ended up reading all this year, and I have not continued on it.
yeah, because I think I read the first book in March and then the second and third one in April. I was like, there we go, job done.
yeah. I've been seeing more attention brought to Juliette Marillier this last year, and somebody was saying, "How come this author's not brought up more often?" I was thinking, I remember Abby bringing this author up quite a bit a couple of years ago with Daughter
And
of
I
the
think
Forest.
like Daughter of the Forest is her most well known. And actually, I feel like it's got a lot more Goodreads like ratings and reviews than I expected because I feel as though she's not so talked about on BookTube, but I think it's got quite a few ratings on it, more than I expected. Because I would still consider her quite underhyped.
Yeah, my favorite book by her is actually, or the first book I read by her actually is still one of my favorites, and it's like no one ever talks about that one. Everyone talks about Daughter of the Forest, but
Daughter of
I
the
never
Forest.
hear anyone talking about Wildwood Dancing, and it's so good.
Daughter of the Forest has 66,000 ratings on Goodreads.
Wow.
So
Interesting.
maybe people are catching on to it.
Yeah. There's
That was
a self sorry,
sorry.
that's okay.
I
There's a
think I'm lagged.
self-published there's a self-published author, Von Roycroft, who has a book called The Severing Sun, and I believe that Juliette Marillier, unless I'm getting the author mixed up, I think he said that she was his mentor, and she even has a blurb on his book. So I found it interesting that she was supporting self-pub, and it's not like whimsical romantic fantasy by any means. It's nothing like that. It's more, I don't know, I can't remember. I mean, I just remember there are a lot of Klansmen. It's definitely more fantasy. It doesn't have the same elements at all. But I just find it interesting that she was kind of sponsoring his books in a way. So, do you have a preference between the two? The Grimm one, sorry, I'm forgetting the name of it. Blackthorn and Grimm, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Versus the Daughter of the Forest. Is there a do you two have a preference between those two?
I think I'd say Daughter of the Forest might still be my favorite book that she has written, but I think as a trilogy and all of the books together, I preferred Blackthorn and Grimm.
Okay. Wow.
And I have not finished that trilogy, but Daughter of the Forest was my favorite book or was it my second favorite book?
A favorite book.
Of 2022. 3?
Like the years.
I know they
No,
all blur together
2022.
on BookTube.
I think it was 2022. I think sort of Kaigan took it, but Daughter of the Forest was like number 2 or something like that.
Okay.
I don't know. But that one I love. Blackthorn and Grimm, I haven't continued on with the series, but Dreamer's Pool, I think I gave 4 stars. 4.5 stars. Really enjoyed it, but I think Daughter of the Forest made more impact. But I haven't finished the series, so I can't really say like I don't know where it's gonna go. But I highly recommend people check out Wildwood Dancing by her. It's really cool because unlike a lot of her other books, it actually takes place in Transylvania. Which is that I get the 2 confused, Romania and Transylvania. Or is Transylvania old Romania?
I
I
don't
don't
know.
know. Do you guys know?
What's the question exactly again?
It's
Transylvania, is that Romania?
I
yeah.
think so.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Sounds right.
But is Transylvania a real place, or is that just like Dracula
Made up.
made up?
That's a
I
good
think it used
question.
to be called that. That's what I was thinking.
Oh. Well, geez, that just shows what I know. I'm totally ignorant
I could be wrong.
on this
That's why I
question.
was asking. I could totally be wrong. But this is where that takes place. And it's different from some of her other books. Not that I've read her whole backlist. But it's technically YA, but it doesn't read like a modern day YA, you know.
Yeah.
Highly recommend. I love it.
I need to get to this author at some point. The Rogue here says historical fantasy has been my favorite subgenre to read lately. It's mostly been GGK, Guy Gabriel K, but I'm looking forward to trying Juliet Marillier. Same
I need
thing
to try
here.
Guy Gabriel K. I've heard wonderful things.
I love Guy Gabriel K, at least the 3 books I've read so far. Tigana being my least favorite of those 3. I do not recommend starting with that book, even though it's the most fantasy of the 3 the most fantasy book I think he's written. But I really loved A Song for Arbonne, and it's based on like historical Middle Ages France with troubadours, and so I love that era, and I love troubadour stuff. And then his other book I read, The Lines of Alrazon, is based on medieval Spain. And his books they're very historical. They're set in secondary worlds, but they might as well be Spain and France. And they're incredible. He's just an incredibly gifted writer. Also writes really, really good female characters, in my opinion. But I would love to read Juliet Marillier. I mean, I've heard such phenomenal things about her as well. What was I going to say? Also, Catherine Arden, you two mentioned that author as well. I've only read the Winter Night trilogy, thanks to Evie here, and I really enjoyed that. I noticed that you really enjoyed her newest book, Abby. Is that correct?
Yes. I don't think I enjoyed it like as much as the Winter Night trilogy, but I did still really enjoy it, and I think it was very well written for something that's a little bit outside my comfort zone because I don't really read much war fiction.
Yeah. Oh, so did that one take place during World War I or World War II or
World War One?
Okay. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, because a lot of historical fiction I feel like centers on World War II. So kinda nice to
I
have
just
that.
read that too, and I'm pretty sure it took over for like my favorite book of the year. So,
Oh,
like,
really?
yeah, that's why I'm like hopping up and down. I'm like,
Oh, how exciting.
yeah,
What
I
you love
just
about
read
it?
that. And Abby, how did I miss it? When did you read that?
June.
Oh, I must not have gotten to the June wrap. I'm behind on YouTube right now. Yeah, I just read that in it was actually the beginning of July. Like it was just like, and I'm in a slump now because of it. So
Wow. Wow.
yeah,
Well,
it's amazing. It's so
yeah.
good.
I
It's not like what people would expect, I think, because of the World War I setting. And I would also say it's really good for fall because it's about ghosts. So that's kind of the fantasy aspect. It's more like I would say a historical fiction by like
With
Kristen
speculative,
Hanna.
I'd say like with speculative elements because it doesn't really feel super fantasy.
Right, with I would say more like the spooky speculative elements. Like it's kind of like if Kristen Hanna wrote a gothic horror speculative book.
okay.
that's how I felt like. And my favorite book of the year before this was Four Winds by Kristen Hanna. Kristen Hanna? I don't
Yes.
know. But I had never read her before, and I'm very into history. I majored in politics in college and worked in politics and then worked in law. And history is something that really interests me. And I really find a lot of, as someone who grows a lot of food, I really find settings, especially like World War One, World War Two, and depression and the Great Depression, to be very interesting when people are having to go back and grow a lot of their own food. So I found that interesting with Four Winds, and then with this one, it just hit those like hard times kind of elements to me, even though there wasn't like a garden and growing food in that, but those like the similar struggles, I guess. And I just found it very just so atmospheric, almost more atmospheric than The Bear and the Nightingale. But like I know most people don't agree with me on that one, but I found it to be just incredibly atmospheric. I
I
loved
love
it.
what you were saying too about growing food, like just putting that much thought into how people lived and how they survived during that time. I've only read from Kristen Hanna. Wait, are we talking about Kristen Hanna or Catherine Arden? I'm like
Both.
lost.
See,
Both, yeah.
welcome to the
Um,
Hannah ADHD train. Like,
yeah. So I've only read from Kristen Hanna. I read The Nightingale. I wasn't crazy about that book, and I can't remember why, but I really enjoyed The Great Alone. I mean, it
okay.
gets pretty. She does love to like go as emotionally hard as possible. That does seem to be her style. And then with Catherine Arden, I feel like yeah, her sense of atmosphere is excellent, and she has such a good way of writing emotionally. Like everything she writes has an emotion. I felt the emotion of Vasya in the Winter Night trilogy, and I loved it. I loved the passion in her writing.
I felt even more struggle and emotion from this book, I think.
Mm.
Now, Bear and the Nightingale and the Winter Night trilogy are an all-time favorite of mine. Bear and the Nightingale I've read twice in the last like 3 years. It's used to be in my top 5 favorite books, and it still probably still is, but I don't know. This one, I'm still thinking about it, but I think I might like it more than the Winter Night trilogy, and that's crazy to me, but I thought that the emotion, she really pushed it on the emotion for this one. It was just so traumatic and gut-wrenching and beautiful.
Wow. You are selling this book, and I know you both loved it.
I feel like those are the right words.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Traumatic and emotional and
Goodness. Have you all read any McKillop, Patricia McKillop?
I want to.
I read several of her books. I bet you both would enjoy her books. I read several of them a long, long time ago, uh, like over a decade ago, long time ago, and I just don't remember them. I remember I went to my library and I kept on checking out her books, reading them, taking them back, checking out another. So I clearly enjoyed her books, but I don't remember anything about them except that I do think they fit that vibe of being kind of fairy tale retelling, like very whimsical. That's what I remember the most, and she's super popular. Like, I keep hearing people talk and gush on and on what a gifted writer she is or was. I don't know if she's still actively writing or if she's still alive for that matter, but
She's
she's,
got quite a large backlist, I know that.
huge. Yeah, yeah. But it does give me that vibe of, like, the readathon you were talking about, so I think that would maybe be a good one to check out, and this is a popular title from her I haven't read, but,
Right,
Beat
yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's on my
Um
TBR.
the never-ending TBR.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and see, Matt says it here. I might recommend Patricia McKillop from Marie fans.
Yeah.
So, definitely a good recommendation here. As for me, would I ever do a top 10 series of all time? It's my goal. It's actually my goal for this year to do a top 10 series. I do have a list of my top 10 series right now, and I don't know why I keep chickening out on making the video, but one will come at some point. I think the hard part of when it comes to doing a top 10 series though, is I'm always thinking, but I haven't read Dandelion Dynasty yet. I haven't read live ship traders yet. There's always like something on my list where I feel like I should probably complete that before I make the list. But I guess you could always update these lists.
Yeah,
I mean,
I have it on my like to-do list to film because I filmed one in, I think it was 2021, and I haven't updated it since. So it's probably due an update. And there are definitely things that will be staying put. And then there'll be some new things to come in, and probably things that will be coming off. I just feel it's one of those things that's ever evolving, isn't it?
yes, for sure. Do you mind sharing with us what your number one was from that list? I can't remember.
I think I had two, and I think they will both still be on the list. I had the David Bad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty, which will continue and stay probably near the top. And I also had Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne.
Yeah. And you must be very excited. Yeah, you must be excited about the new book coming out from John Gwynne this year.
Yes, I need to reread the first two and then be ready for it.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, Abby Salter is a massive John Gwynne fan. She has a whole entire guide to John Gwynne or overview of his books. So if you love John Gwynne, definitely check out Abby's channel.
Yeah, although I feel like it's been a while since I've read anything from him, because there was a time when I was reading like all of the Faithful and the Fallen, then I was reading the spin-off trilogy, then it wasn't that long after the first book in the Bloodsworn saga came out, and then I feel as though I've been done and ready and waiting. Yeah. So I haven't had as many opportunities to share my love of John Gwynne lately.
Yeah, and I think it's only because he hasn't come out with another book in a while. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm sure that'll come back to your channel very soon once that book comes out. Yeah. So Hannah, what about you? Have you done a top 10 series video?
I did do a favorite fantasy of all time. And I think that's what's kind of hard is so someone literally asked me this, was it yesterday? They asked, have you done a video? It was just a comment. Have you done a video of your favorite books of all time? And I realized, no, I haven't. I did have, I think it was maybe 6 months ago or so that I did my favorite fantasy of all time. But it's not fantasy series, just fantasy in general, I think. So, and I have done bingeable, one that's like bingeable series, which, I mean, I guess could count. But the problem is I read so many different things. And yes, fantasy tends to, like, the majority of my favorite books of all time are probably fantasy or romance. I read more romance, but my favorites tend to be more fantasy, which is kind of weird, I know, but I think it leads back to the whole mental health thing. A lot of the times that I'm reading, I'm not looking for a favorite book, and I'm not reading a book that I think will be a favorite book. I'm reading a book that will distract me or get me through, So I think that's where that comes in. But I guess I need to do, and it's just hard. I don't know how to compare some of my favorite horror books to my favorite sci-fi books. I guess those are more easily comparable, but to like a cozy fantasy book that's a favorite, for example, or some historical romances that I love. Like, how do I compare those?
I feel like it's hard to just put all the genres into one video. I feel like what I've done before was like fantasy series, and then I think I did a standalones video and did it as two separate things.
I wish I just had like one or two genres, because I love to like be able to go to certain channels that like you're gonna get some amazing like fantasy recommendations or whatever it is that they specialize in. Like, I have people I go to for horror, for example, and they can like really deep dive into the genre and everything like that. And I'm all surface level on everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like it's hard on BookTube. I don't like that about BookTube, honestly. It's like my one, I guess if I have to be honest, like one of my challenges with it is I do feel like engagement comes from being very niche, very much in a specific zone. Like the more you are on one specific genre trend, like the more your brand flourishes, so to speak, which I'm not a brand kind of person. I think you talked about that too, Hannah. Like you're more focused on being, I'm a person who reads. And that's what my channel is about. And it's a hobby. And I think that's probably true for all three of us. It's like a hobby thing.
Yeah. And I think that can be a hard thing as well, especially if you gain an audience of people that do really like that one certain genre, that then there's this, but if I read and talk about books that are outside of that, will the audience stay? But then I don't want that to be dictating my reading. I want my reading to be dictated by what is appealing to me and what I find enjoyment in, as opposed to what will match with what's going to perform.
Exactly. And I feel like, especially this year, I'm like, I can't help it. I feel like more than ever, I can't help but read what I want to read. I can't just read because numbers kind of thing or engagement. But I also that you do feel, I think, a certain, of course, you please your viewers too, and you appreciate and respect the audience and the people who followed and decided to subscribe to your channel. So it's not easy. It's not that simple either. But yeah, it is kind of hard when you do want to read diversely. But I find for myself that reading other kinds of books and genres, it only adds to my love of fantasy. Like fantasy is always going to be my number one genre, but reading another book outside of that, outside of fantasy, it doesn't deplete that love of fantasy. It adds to it. It makes me feel like I can almost add more to my understanding of the genre in some ways by contrasting it with other genres. I don't know.
Yeah.
Thoughts about that?
And also there, I feel like you kind of what you said, but like you can pick out things and notice that, like, I mean, almost every book has a romance in it.
Yeah.
Almost every book, no matter what genre it is, or sci-fi elements in horror, or you know what I'm saying? You can kind of pick those out more too, and I like to read all over the place. The thing that worries me, not really worries me, but makes me almost feel bad with my channel is when I kind of hyper focus into a certain genre, especially a genre that I don't think a lot of my viewers are really interested in. For me, like horror or sci-fi, and I'll go through months at a time, like a month at a time sometimes, where that's what I want to read, and then I'll go through a lot of times where it's reading more of what they are used to seeing from me, which is romance, fantasy, and fantasy romance, and cozy fantasy, and all of those in between. But overall, I read diversely, but there are times that I really hyper focus into something that is just not at all like I know people aren't going to be interested in.
Yeah. No, I totally feel that conflict too. Like I think you talked about this about sci-fi. I've also been reading a lot more sci-fi this year. I know you mentioned that in a recent video too,
Yeah.
uh, which is, a little bit of a departure, not too far away from fantasy. But do you have a preference in your type of fantasy? I mean, do you prefer romantasy, or do you prefer fantasy? I know romantasy is fantasy. I want to be clear. I don't think that romantasy is not fantasy. I take issue with the idea that it should be shelved differently in some ways. But yeah, do you two prefer romantasy over fantasy, or vice versa, or is it just a mood thing?
Well, there's a spectrum. I mean, we can all talk about the autism spectrum. There's a fantasy romance spectrum too. Okay. There is, and people I guess I get so confused on this. Is it fantasy romance, or is it romantasy, or is it fantasy with romance? And to me, or is it a romance that takes place in a fantasy world? But really, you can't even call it fantasy romance because it's just smut with elves. You know what I'm saying? It's a spectrum here. Okay. I mean, even a lot of very well known and loved epic fantasy series like the David Bad trilogy, you could argue someone could easily nowadays say, "Oh, it's romantasy."
Because it doesn't have a romance in it.
It does. And it's a plot percentage thing to me. If something is if a fantasy book is, or any book, let's say any book, be sci-fi, be whatever, thriller, you could say that there's a romantic suspense spectrum too with thrillers, but it's a percentage. So if the romance if the plot constitutes 50% romance, and we're talking about the plot, like what moves the plot forward, what the point of the plot is, if it's 50% or more romance, then I consider it in the romance genre, you know? And And right there you see like when it hits like the between the 30 and like the 70, that's when people are kind of still calling it fantasy romance, you know. But it's different people are going to think someone might say, well, that book is like 35% romance and that book is like 50% romance. They could kind of disagree on the percentage, right? But so because of that, I don't know if I can answer that. This is what I'm trying to say. Sorry. Because of that, I don't know if I can answer if fantasy romance is my favorite over romance or fantasy, or if fantasy romance is my favorite over fantasy. So I will just say fantasy. Uh, if we're choosing between the two of those, because I think the majority of my favorite fantasy romance books were not like Smut with Elves. You know what I'm saying? I think they were a well balanced plot, maybe right around the 40 to 60% mark of romance being the plot. I do read Smut with Elves, but they're just not they're not on my like favorites of all time list. Uh, so I do read a lot of fantasy romance of all along the spectrum. But I hope that answers.
Yeah, no. Do you have thoughts about this, Abby? Like the whole entire marketing or evolution of what's now considered the romantasy market?
I think that I don't really know where I'm going with my thoughts.
I never do.
It really is a spectrum, though. I would
Yeah, I
honestly,
agree that it's a
with that.
spectrum. That it isn't just like you get to this point and suddenly you're into fantasy romance and outside of fantasy. And I think for me, I do like fantasy romance, but I think I prefer a more of a subplot, in that, like in the Dave Bad trilogy, where it doesn't like take over the plot, but it definitely has an element in it because it is just part of life. And I think I generally get more satisfaction when the plot elements or the fantastical elements, the politics, are done more strongly. I can get a bit dissatisfied and bored when everyone thinks too happy in a romantic book, and I'm like, okay, it's all resolved now. You're together, great. And there's still 3 more books to go. So what's going to happen now?
Yeah.
Whereas when the plotting of the fantastical elements are done well, then that will always keep me engaged.
Yeah.
But in terms of the marketing, I think marketing's gone a little bit funny. I mean, one of the things that I think has gone funny is looking at like Fairy Loot and the way that they are marketing their certain boxes. And I'm not subscribed to them anymore, but I did get their adult box a couple of years ago. But now they've got their adult box, they've got their romantasy box, they've got their YA box, they've launched their epic fantasy box. And I'm like,
I didn't know that.
I'm
Wow.
like, so what's happened to adult? Isn't the adult box meant to be the epic fantasy box? So like, what books are you going to be putting in the adult box if you're not putting romantasy in there? You're not putting epic fantasy. So what fantasy books are you putting in the adult box?
Yeah.
I think I would say on the Fairy Loot train, where you were talking about Fairy Loot, makes me think a lot of that confusion between the romantasy and YA too, right? And that's that confusion with the box. A lot of people I hear have said that the romantasy box just feels kind of like another YA box. Now, I don't get a subscription box, but that is an issue that I do have sometimes with romantasy, fantasy romance, is the recycling of plots. You have so many books that are telling the same exact story, and you don't have that as much with fantasy. I mean, you have some. I mean, you could say like a whole lot of fantasy is like Lord of the Rings retellings or something. You know, I guess you could. Okay. But it's a real issue with fantasy romance right now, especially with marketing wanting certain things. Example, I just tried to read Jasad Air. Abby, have you read that?
No, but I own it.
Okay. So I was very excited for this book, especially I was thinking David Bad maybe. Like I was thinking it was gonna be I was thinking David Bad, but from instead of 25% romance or 20% romance, maybe 40 to 50% romance, you know? But that it would have like a really interesting plot and this and that. But instead, I feel like marketing and or publishing decided they only wanted to take, because you know, there's a serious issue with publishing and taking on authors of color, BIPOC female authors, you know. And so they took a chance, but only if your plot's exactly like all these other white ones. You know what I'm saying? And that's what it felt like to me. So the plot itself was a cookie cutter of all of the most popular fantasy romance and YA, which YA fantasy I feel like is fantasy romance sometimes turns into YA romance with smut. But like it was literally just a cookie cutter, and it was so disappointing, and this is happening so all over the place. It's like, okay, I picked this up thinking it was going to be unique because we've got this Egyptian setting, and I thought that would be so cool and unique, and it would. But I mean, looking back, I looked at the synopsis, and it tells you it's going to be a cookie cutter, but that is an issue.
Is some of that, and that we now have read so many things, and that I've been reading for all of my life now, and that it is hard for things to be like unique because I've read so much. And then I think me and Patrick were talking about this the other day, that you can have, it's so much harder now to find a 5-star favorite because you've read so much, and actually the more you read, the more picky you get, and the more that you see things done over and over again, that actually finding favorites is harder.
I'm sure that's some of it. That's a totally valid thought. Like I'm sure that's some of it, especially for booktubers or Instagram or bookstagrammers, people that read a lot, especially reviewers tend to read a lot, obviously. But I had just read When the Moon Hatched too, like only a couple weeks earlier, and I felt like that one was totally unique. I mean, this one had, like, not to go on a rant here, but I mean, it had the secret princess, which I mean, it tells you in the synopsis. I mean, all this is in the synopsis in the beginning of the book. But it's like secret hiding princess, tournaments, enemies to lovers. He's really the bad prince, you know, is the love interest. You know what I'm saying? So it had those, like, but the thing is, they weren't done well because they didn't even explain like why this tournament exists or why these trials, or you know. Anyway, there's a lot that do those things, but
By the way, you both read that book recently, right?
I haven't read it, the Jeff
I
Erdman.
thought you did. I don't know why I thought you did. When the Moon
I just own it.
Oh, okay. Maybe that's what I saw it on. Yeah.
I hope you like it, Abby. Like, I hope it's just one of those things where I've read so much fantasy romance, especially, you know, in the last year or so, year or two, that I'm just kind of jaded. Is jaded the right word for that? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, maybe I hope that's it.
And I think I go through phases with what I read. Like, I think there are certain, I guess, months, years where I'll gravitate more towards one sort of fantasy over another. Like, I think a couple of years ago, I read a lot of the epic fantasies, like the John Gwynne, the Ken Liu, and they're long and they're epic and they take a lot of time to read. And then I've got to the point where I'm like, I can't read such long, extensive, time-consuming books because I need a break. And it's that cyclical nature, and I'm like, I'm sure it'll come back around. I'm sure I'll come back around, and it'll be Robin Hobb's time or something, and I'll be able to read those books again, because you start seeing the same things repeated. And it's good to sort of mix things up, even within the fantasy genre.
I'm still hoping that you will like it, because I mean, I get it. They're popular tropes for a reason. It didn't work for me. It just didn't work for me.
Yeah. Do you two have any, so when it comes to romance, which is not a genre I'm super well read in, do you two have any sort of tropes that you gravitate towards? And then on the flip side, any ones that you don't like that are like, I'm done with that? Like, some people hate love triangles, for example, or are there any type of fantasy tropes? I mean, not fantasy tropes, but romance tropes that you two gravitate towards?
I mean, I wouldn't say I read loads of romance. I do mix it in every now and again. And I was actually thinking today, I was like, I feel as though love triangles need to come back. Like, they're a great way to maintain angst, even though like we hated them at the time, but we didn't realize like how good they actually were. And having like different teams of people on each side. But in terms of tropes that I think it's easier to think of tropes that I don't like and tropes that I would avoid. Like, accidental pregnancy in a romance book, just no. But in terms of like how the love interest comes up, whether it's friends to lovers, enemies to lovers, I think I'm pretty open to most of those.
Yeah, I feel like enemies to lovers kind of took over for.
That's this times love triangle.
Yeah, it kind of took over for love triangle. So I don't know. I have a lot of favorite tropes for romances. I like the forced proximity, and I do like enemies to lovers. I'm not a huge friends to lovers fan, but
Same.
huh?
I said same. I don't like. I feel like that's an unpopular opinion on BookTube, though. But I have a hard time with friends to lovers. I think, though I'm not as experienced in reading romance, I just don't know that. I don't know why it just doesn't seem like that exciting to me. And the weird thing is, I feel like a lot of people hate enemies to lovers because, and I can understand, like if it's a toxic dynamic, then I can understand that not being appealing at all. And I'm not necessarily for that necessarily, but I also think that there's a distinction between what you can enjoy in fiction
Yeah.
versus what you want in real life. And that's where I think what I think some people just don't understand. Because like in real life, I'm 100% for be friends with somebody before you get into a relationship with them. I
Right.
lived by that rule, but then reading it in a book, I just find it kind of dull. Like it just doesn't seem as interesting. And then with
Yeah.
enemies to lovers, yeah, and like I mean, I'm sure that could be terrible in real life, or I can understand maybe that if you take that literally, like that could be problematic. But if it's fiction, I just feel like there's a difference in what you can enjoy in fiction versus
Oh yeah.
what you're
There are
promoting
things
in
that you
real
would
life.
read that you would not want to live.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
read
like
tons of.
as a fantasy lover, we can love war and battle and all kinds
Never
of
want to
horrific
experience
things.
it in real life.
Yeah, it doesn't mean you want that in real life.
Yes, and I read a lot of. I'll go through times that I will read like dark romance. I don't do it a lot much anymore, but like I think was it like a month ago I read like 2 mafia romances, and mostly when I read romance, it's well, I'll say like speculative romance. Like it's either it's basically fantasy romance or alien romance, or monster romance or paranormal romance. Just which is speculative. I don't read like contemporary romance. Abby reads contemporary romance a lot more than I do, and I don't even, I don't ever, unless it's like mafia or dark or something like that. It's very rare for me that I do.
I read Emily Henry for the first time this last month, so I read Happy Place, and I really liked it in some ways. Like I thought her writing style was very engaging. I really liked her character work, but unfortunately, the miscommunication trope just I couldn't
I
buy
hate it.
into it. That was the one thing where it fell flat for me. Plus, enemy. It was. I mean, somebody argued with me a little bit about it being friends to lovers because I said, well, it felt like friends to lovers plus miscommunication, which maybe it wasn't quite friends to lovers since the couple didn't really have like a long-term friendship before they got together, but it did feel like there was a strong basis of friendship underlying their dynamic. And then the miscommunication trope really didn't make sense from that vantage point for me. So I'm kind
Miscommunication
of,
is the worst.
huh?
Yeah,
Miscommunication is the worst.
It is. It's
the
hard to
worst.
sell that. Yeah. I mean, you have to
And
do
I
a really
honestly
good
think it's
job.
that trope alone that is why I mostly read speculative because with
Mm.
those ones at least, there's usually like a big enemy or a something else trying to get between them. Maybe the packs are at war or like I don't know what. There's a space alien pirate coming to get them. I don't know. But there's usually something else that can take the place for the climax and the conflict. Uh, and I get to avoid that by not reading much contemporary romance. But there's a lot of great contemporary romance. I've read a few really good contemporary romances that don't use that, but it does happen a lot. I hate miscommunication.
Yeah, it just doesn't work for me. I love Pride and Prejudice though, and it worked for me in that particular scenario, but that was enemies to lovers. So maybe I think I'm on, I don't know, maybe it's a combination of tropes that has to work. And Abby, I actually love triangles. I did a whole video on why you might not hate love triangles in adult fantasy because there are several fantasy books that I've read in recent years and I never thought about it. And part of this, I wonder if it's gender bias and if it's also um, the bias between how we look at YA versus adult because I realized like I had read a lot of epic fantasy that were written by male authors that happen to have love triangles, but I didn't even think about it when I read it. It was like after the fact that I realized, oh, there was a love triangle in that book. And nobody talks about it, but it's just blended in with the
Right.
plot and with the high stakes of everything going on politically or the themes of the story that I think a love triangle can be amazing. I think it can be executed exceptionally well.
I'm thinking Stormlight here.
Oh, I mean, is there one though? I mean, there's kind of the
I'm definitely
potential for one.
rooting for someone to be with someone that they are not with.
Me too.
Yeah,
Me too.
And I
I'm
still haven't
curious
finished
now.
Rhythm of War.
I'm still hoping. I'm still
I
hoping.
was I was kind of hoping for that too, if we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah,
But
probably because I think it's the only one in there.
yeah. I mean, it seemed like there was a hint of one at the end of book 2, if you're talking about what I'm
Right.
talking about,
Yeah.
but then it didn't seem to go that direction.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
And ever since, I've just been like,
mm,
did I
yeah.
imagine this? Or
Yeah, I wondered that. I was like, "Did I imagine that?" Or but then it
I'm
seems like
starting
other people
my
did too.
reread of the second book like later on this month, so I'll let you guys know.
we can't
Yeah.
all have imagined it.
Yeah, I think it was there though, because 'cause I've talked to other people since, and they're like, "No, there was definitely hints of something," and then it didn't quite go that direction. Maybe he just figured people wouldn't like it or have judgments about that, I don't know. But we'll see. There's still time for things to change and
Yeah, I still need to finish Rhythm of War.
Yes. What did you think of Oathbringer?
Oathbringer, I liked. It took me a long time to read it, but I liked it in the end.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh,
but I've been 200 pages into Rhythm of War since April, so
yeah. My least
Rhythm
favorite.
of War, it was the first book in that series I gave 4 stars.
Yeah.
it's not that it's bad. It's just very long.
I got really well, this is not a spoiler. There's a lot of talks about what are those contraptions?
Gabriel's?
Yes, there's a lot
Yeah.
of intense talk. Like it was a
Extremely
lot of
repetitive
Gabriel
talks
content,
about that.
and I just thought that like he could have docked 150 pages just by like editing that down just a touch.
Yep. I agree. We'll see what you think at the end though, Abby. I'm really
Yeah.
curious.
I need to get back to it.
Well, you're doing it the smart way though, because you're spreading them out over time. My mistake, at least for me, I know some people have been very successful doing what I did, but it wasn't successful for me, is I crammed so much Sanderson into 1 year. That was my year of 2020. I read all the Stormlight books up to Rhythm of War and then ended the year with Rhythm of War. I read I think at least the year before, up until that year, I read all the Mistborn books that had been published, Warbreaker, all like 2 of the Skyward books, and yeah, it was, like,
That's a
so much
lot.
Sanderson. It was a
I did
lot.
that too, but I wasn't doing booktube at the time.
Yeah. For me, it burned me
Well,
out.
oh,
I
I
needed
bet,
a break.
yeah.
I needed a break. But yeah, book 4 specifically, it's not that I didn't enjoy it, but there were certain things in his writing that started to degrade on me after a while,
Yeah.
and, yeah, yeah, so yeah, but hopefully book 5 will be good. I'm probably
I'm
gonna be
hoping
like
it's
you,
like
Abby,
middle
I'm
child
probably not gonna get
syndrome,
to it
but just late.
immediately. Hmm? I'm
Oh,
sorry?
sorry.
Go ahead.
I was saying I hope it's like middle child syndrome, but just late
Yeah, we'll see.
or middle
He's
book
taking his
syndrome.
time. I mean, at least he's taking his time with it though, because I mean, he's known as being like a writing factory, just pumping the books out. So at least he's taking his time with it. So maybe
I mean, he's definitely had a lot out in between
oh,
Rhythm of
that's true.
War and this one.
Very true. Like he can't help himself. Yeah. Yeah. And I know some people just can't get into his style at all. Yeah, I don't know. And it's interesting because let's see, 2020 was the year to read Sanderson. There wasn't much else to do than reading. That's so true. And that's what I did a lot of for sure. But it's also interesting because I mean, I haven't read any Sanderson since then. And that was a long time ago. It was like 4 years ago.
Oh,
So
wow.
I don't even know. I don't know how much my reading taste has changed since then.
Are you
Yeah.
gonna reread?
There's no way. I don't think so. Unless I do it via audio, but I've just got so many other books I wanna read between now and then. I wanna start the Dandelion Dynasty. I need to finish, this Baker series I'm reading. I need to what else? I'm reading an 11-book series, an 11-book epic fantasy series by Jenny Wirtz right now, The Wars of Light and Shadow, which by the way, like it's very epic. It's very grand at scale and her writing style is it's very very rich. She has a very, very rich writing style, which is not going to appeal to a lot of people, especially people who love Sanderson. Very different writing styles. But her romance is amazing in that series.
Hmm.
I have to say over and over again that if I could find romantasy, like I found romance in her subplots of Wars of Light and Shadow, sign me up. I would be all over it. I love the way she writes romance. Love it.
We had a comment earlier from someone about Grace Draven. You might try her. I think that Grace Draven, I consider Grace Draven to be like Juliet Marillier, but like on the romance side of the spectrum.
I can't find that
Have
comment.
you read any Grace Draven?
I've read Radiance.
Oh, okay. And that one's more like kind of sci-fi, isn't it?
It's the marriage of convenience between the human population and the fantastical creature population.
Okay. I haven't read that one yet, but I've read and Treat Me is a Beauty and the Beast retelling that I read by her. And it was not like any other Beauty and the Beast retelling. It was really cool. But I feel like she's Juliet Marillier-esque, but
I'm gonna write down that name, and I'm sorry to whoever in the comments maybe put that name in and I missed it. What's the name of the author again?
Grace Draven. Did you like Radiance, Abby? I know that one's really popular.
Mhm. Yeah, I did. But then I was told that the rest of the series goes downhill, so I didn't continue.
Yeah, I've read Entreat Me, and then I have soft DNF'd Phoenix Unbound, but I want to pick that one back up. I know Peru's Project read that recently and really enjoyed it, and she's like on a Grace Draven kick right now.
Oh, I think I have heard her talk about that author now that you
Yeah.
mention it.
And I
Okay.
feel like if you're wanting to find that right fantasy romance when you're someone who reads primarily epic fantasy, but you want that more beautiful and atmospheric writing a little bit more, I think that she might be a good one to pick up. It's still romance. Definitely, it's definitely on the romance side, like over 50%, but she does take the time to create some of the world building and create some of the atmosphere, and her writing, I think, is very top tier.
Yeah. Okay, good to know. Yeah. Wirtz's writing is really interesting because, like I said, it's epic fantasy and there is war. There are all these different um, types of groups, like a group of wizards, there's a group of witches, so to speak, or sorceresses. But there are also it's also a world where there were once unicorns and and centaurs and sun children, and it has this really interesting metaphysical light spectrum magic that's in the world, and it's also there's also music magic. So it's an incredibly complex world, but yeah, I love the female characters in that series, and I love the romance in that series. It's been a great surprise for me. Polly asked a question here, a question for the three of you. What was the last new to you author's book that made you want to read everything they'd write?
While I look this up, let me just say I own the first two books in that series, and I really want to read it.
So I'm just going to look at my bookshelves.
The
Yeah.
Janie Wirtz series.
I think I know my answer to this. I'm going to go ahead and answer then. I think I'm just going to have to give it to Guy Gabriel Kay. Even though I started my journey with him last year, I knew after reading the first book I read by him, The Lions of Alrasan, set in medieval Spain, that I just needed to read more from this author. And then the second book I read from him, A Song for a Bond, which is there on my shelf. I don't know if you can see it. Let's see. Blue book that's back there standing up under my above my hand. That particular book just blew me away. I loved it so much that, and of course it was kind of specific to me and my taste in a way, because it, like I said, it incorporated song and music and troubadours. But it's again that rich, beautiful writing, but it's not hard to read by any means. I would say Janny Wirtz's style is one of the most richest to read. I think it's far more like more complex sentences than Guy Gavriel Kay's style, but I really loved Guy Gavriel Kay's books, the few I read, the few since I started reading him last year or late last year, and I intend to read as many as possible. So that's probably the answer I'll go with.
I was thinking, because it can be a little bit hard that I can get into an author and read that trilogy. I don't know, Catherine Arden as an example, like I read all of the Bear and the Nightingale trilogy, but then I haven't been interested in her middle grade series. And so there are quite a few authors where I'm like, oh, well, I really love that work that you did, but your other work doesn't appeal to me in terms of its theming or what it focuses on. So then it's hard to think of it exactly, oh, that was a favorite series, but am I reaching to get to all of their books? And that's not always the case.
So true. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a few like that. And then there's also quite a few where I've read like the trilogy and there isn't anything else out by them that obviously I would be interested in seeing what they came out with next. But I don't know what that's going to be. Or I just haven't got to it yet. Like, I don't know, James Islington, I want to read The Will of the Many. I just haven't got to, because I'm trying to wait until more books are out in the series. I'd say Juliette Marillier is one that I will like go back to. I want to read more from her and read more of her backlist. And also it takes a lot of time to like get through an author's backlist as well, especially if they've written a lot and have been writing for many, many years. I guess like Ken Liu, I haven't read one of his short stories, The Hidden Girl collection, but I've read everything else. And I would definitely be interested in what he comes out with next.
I was blown away by the Paper Menagerie collection. Loved it. And loved it so much. Just finished that last month.
So I'm trying to think of authors where I've like gone across different genres because it's that author, which is I think a little bit harder. I guess like V. Schwab, I've read a lot of her books and have continued to read them, and she's sort of done quite a few different things.
Yeah. I feel you on that too, what you were saying too about like, for example, a lot of people do an auto by author type of video, and I don't have very many auto by authors. Like, for example, I loved all the First Law books that I've read, but I don't really feel motivation to read The Shattered Sea, at least anytime soon. And then with Stephen Erickson, like I love the Malazan series, but I haven't read any of his other books, like in sci-fi. I know he's written some sci-fi and some other types of books that I just haven't gravitated towards for some reason. I haven't even read all his Malazan books, to be honest, just the 10 in the series.
Yeah, and I guess like the same Fonda Lee, like I love the Greenbone saga, but then the other things she's come out with, I haven't been so interested in. So it is quite hard to think of those, like whatever you come out with, I'm going to buy it. Although you do get authors, I guess, will stick with their like niche and theme across series. So then it becomes easy to know that you would like continue to pick them up. Like Sanderson, although he does diverge a little bit, you pretty much know that you're going to be getting fantasy from him.
Yeah. You know what you kind of know what you're in for with Sanderson, but I agree. He has been doing some different things like the Secret Project books.
And I wouldn't read, or I haven't been interested in reading the Steelheart.
Oh yeah, me neither.
Series.
Haven't been interested in that. Yeah.
I think mine are, I'll just go like loose with it. I'm going to mute myself for a second. My boys are coming in. But the two are romance books, but they're just authors that I read from. And I'm like, okay, I need to read a bunch more of their books. And that was Lorraine Heath, who is a historical romance author. And I read two of her historical romances this last month, and or was it May? And they were both 5 stars, and I really need to read more from her. And Elizabeth Stevens, who I read one of her alien romances, and it's probably the best alien romance that I've read. It was exceptional, and I want to read more from her, and I also want to try her paranormal series too. And I just picked up the second book in her alien romance series that I enjoyed. So those 2 are ones that I've read recently that I had never read before, that reading their books made me think I need to read a bunch more from them.
Yeah, that's cool.
I have a
Yeah,
few that I wish would write more books, where I'm like, come on, Essay Chakraborty, I'm ready, I'm waiting. Like, when's the next one coming?
has she not come out with any more books recently? I thought she
I think
did.
she's working on the second Amina book.
Oh, that's right. Okay. I always have to put it in my head that she's the same author who wrote the Daevabad trilogy, is the same author who wrote the one you're just mentioning, the
Amina
pirate
El
one.
Sarafi one.
Yeah. Did you like that one?
I did, but not as much as Daevabad.
Yeah, that's what I've heard from a lot of people.
Yeah, I kind of picked it up for the swashbuckling readathon and put it back down. But I also do that like all of the time, so that doesn't really mean much.
Do you like soft DNF a lot? Is that what you mean?
I soft DNF constantly. Especially right now, after reading Catherine Arden's newest book. Sorry, my husband is texting me kid stuff. I've got 2 little ones for anyone who doesn't follow my channel. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and he's got them right now and messaging me about them. So, but yes, oftentimes if I read like a really, 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 really good book, sometimes it'll put me almost like into a slumpy situation where I start soft DNFing like left and right. But the thing is that doesn't mean that I won't pick them up later. I'm a mood reader, so I probably soft DNF 3 to 10 times a month. Yeah. And then later I'll pick it up and it can still be like a 4 or 5 star book. I just want to give it its chance when I want to read it, you know, or it could turn into something that I really wasn't going to like and didn't end up liking later, but I still at least gave it its chance.
Are you like a really big time mood reader where you do not have TBRs at all?
I do TBRs and I'm happy if I hit 50%. And if I don't, then that's fine too. And I do it because it's fun and I want to let my viewers know in the moment what I feel like reading coming up. But that doesn't, I think my viewers by now know that 12 hours later, I could look at my TBR and say, yeah, I want nothing to do with any of those books.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So that's just how I roll.
I mean, I don't know if I have the right perception of this or not, but I feel like most viewers are pretty understanding about people's TBRs changing, and that sometimes we as content creators are harder on ourselves about sticking to a TBR than the viewership is. But
I feel as well that as someone that watches BookTube, you watch a handful of people's TBR videos. By the time it gets to the end of the month, you've not really remembered that they've put XYZ on their TBR.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
That's true too.
You're not going to go, oh, she put that in her TBR and she didn't read it.
That'd be so bad if they did though.
Anybody put that in the comment section. If you go, oh, well, you told me you were going to read Rhythm of War and you still haven't read it.
Yeah, let us know in the comment section. Does anybody do you remember people's TBRs by the end of the month? 2, do you get disappointed if people say they're going to read something and don't read it? I'd be very curious. Or if you're watching the replay and you hear this, please let us know in the comment section below. That's such a good point. That
And
almost
really,
makes me
because-
wonder.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, and I was gonna say, and really because I mood read so intensely, or it really affects my enjoyment so much, whether I'm in the mood for it. I would assume that viewers would want more accurate ratings and reviews from me, which I can't give if I'm reading a book just because it was on my TBR, even though I'm not at all in the mood for it. Because then I'm gonna be giving like a 1 or 2 star. I mean, I don't really give 1 stars. I give 6 stars for my favorites. So I don't really give 1 stars. I'm a nice grader. But they're not going to want to see these like 2.5 star reviews from me when it could be a book that I maybe would have really liked if I had given it a chance. So I feel like it's better to give more accurate reviews.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. What about you, Abby? Because I know you've proclaimed yourself a mood reader.
Yeah, claimed.
But you do have TBRs, but you
Yeah,
right?
and I think that there is for me, there is in some ways it is good to have a little bit of structure, because then you can go, okay, this is roughly what I'm going to aim for, but then I don't berate myself if I don't get to it. And I think as a series reader and someone that likes like completing things and finishing things and having that satisfaction of finishing a series, that a lot of the time my TBR is dictated by those series that I picked up. That I'll pick up a series on a whim, and then I'm like, oh well, now I need to put my TBR is going to be finishing off that series for the next like 3 months. Book 2 1 month, book 3 the next month, and so then the TBR sort of structure themselves with me going, okay, I've got these series on the go, so that's what the TBR is, and then you get the mood reading that comes along and goes, oh, let's just throw these things in the middle of that series.
Yeah, that's good. I think that's a good plan. Like I feel like I've actually been pretty good about sticking to a TBR in the last couple of years, and I find it helpful because I have gotten to a point now where I feel overwhelmed by the choices of what to read, and somehow having a TBR helps me feel more focused in my tasks of what I'm going to read next. Because I used to love the feeling of like, "Ooh, what am I gonna read next?" when I get towards the end of the book, and then I started getting to a point like, "Oh, no, I don't know what to read next." So I think it helps me to have a general TBR, but at the same time, like, I don't know, I do find that I love some of my favorite books happen when I pick them up on a whim.
Right.
So
And I don't like that feeling if you have like okay, this is what I'm reading. I need to get to this, to this, to this, that you're then thinking about what you're doing next. That you're going, okay, after I finish this thing, I'm going to read this, which then stops you from really actually appreciating and enjoying what you're currently reading and taking the time to ingest that, because you're constantly thinking about what you're trying to do next.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, no, I agree with that. I don't like that at all. I'd rather be more engaged with what I'm reading at the moment, for sure. But I'm also,
I
like,
think
super careful about what I put on my TBR, like, I try to be very, very curated with what I put on my TBR, making sure that it's something that I am pretty certain I will love, which I think I've gotten better at understanding what my taste is in recent years, which has been a hard thing for me in the past. So, the chances are I usually am pretty good about being present with what I'm with, but yeah, I don't think that's a good feeling. That's usually not a good sign if I'm thinking about what I need to get to next or what I wanna get to next, either situation. Were you gonna say something, Hannah? I'm sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say, I like to use it as like um, the structure if I need the structure. Like you were saying, it's nice to have if so you're not overwhelmed with the choices, which is why I always go to my TBR when it's like time to pick up something else. But if I'm not in the mood for any of the books on there, then I move along.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good way to put it go about it too, is to have some general options and then let your mood decide when you get to the end of the book, "Do I wanna move here to A, or do I wanna move to B or to C?" Having some options in the overall pick of
Mhm.
books. Yeah, absolutely. I personally found myself getting into reading more books at once too, which is a new thing for me as well. That can sometimes help a little bit.
I go through phases, but I think typically when I pick up a book, I'm loyal to the book.
Yes, that could be good. Yeah, I usually find myself with one book at a time, but now and then this year it's happened. It's happened oddly.
I usually
Making
have
my
multiple,
You have multiple. You're a multiple reader.
anywhere from 2 to 6. It can
Oh
happen.
wow. Yeah.
Like, it can happen. I prefer 2 to 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I'm sort of like a max 2, like 1 physical, 1 audio. I feel like
Okay.
if I've started 2 and I'm reading 2 physically, then it's because one of the books isn't really holding my attention,
Right.
and
Mhm. Mhm.
If
that
I get
I'm
up to 5 or 6, I tend to stop. That's when I start, which ones am I gonna thought enough?
Yeah. Making my TBR and what I actually read are like two separate hobbies at this point. Yep. And Jonathan here said that he loses sleep when content creators circumvent my expectations by not adhering to their TPR.
I'm very sorry.
And I guess, with some people, they do appreciate the TBR because they want to read along with the creator. Like I know some people do that. Say, I'm letting you know what I'm reading this month in case you want to join along. And I know some people do pick up books if they see a content creator have it on their TBR, like, oh, I want to read this too, which is always a risk because you don't know that the content creator is going to actually enjoy that book. So it's not necessarily an endorsement just because it's on the TBR.
Yeah.
I would say. I review one book, maybe two, then just mention one book. I am reading next. I was going to ask too, since both of you were talking about star ratings, Hannah, and how that is dictated. You don't want your mood to dictate your star rating if you're not into the book at the moment. Do you two, because you read, I know you two mostly stick to, well, no, you two read a little bit widely, I would say. So, like you were talking about sci-fi, Hannah, in your case, and epic fantasy and romantasy, and then Abby, you enjoy romantasy and epic fantasy, and sometimes a little bit of contemporary romance. Do you find that your rating system is different across genres? Like you're going to judge something solely based on the genre it's in? Or if you have a favorite genre, do you find you're just naturally going to rate epic fantasy higher versus a contemporary romance or something along those lines?
I think my favorites, I think I'm more likely to get 5 stars in fantasy, but I also think it's harder to get the 5 stars in fantasy because I've now become so picky, if that makes sense. That obviously I'm reading more of it, so I will get more 5 stars overall because it is my favorite. But then I actually end up with a lot of 3 and 4 stars because it's now harder for me to find those favorites.
Yeah, that makes sense because I feel like an epic fantasy, when it delivers a lot.
Yes. Yeah.
But there's a lot that's put into an epic fantasy, and usually it's larger page count. There's just a lot more elements going into it.
Yeah, and then so I think that's where the majority of my high ratings are, as opposed to romance. When I do read it, it's rarely a 5 star. I think because it's not giving me the elements of fantasy that I like, but I do like having it there to sort of break things up a little bit. But I know going into them a lot of the time that they won't be 5 stars. Every now and again there is one, but like going in, I don't have the same expectations for it. Although I think expectations can play a role in a reading experience.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah, especially because because you're reading them for different reasons too, like you said. So if you're reading the romance book to just break things up, to just have like a palate cleanser kind of experience, then that's maybe not going to give you the same exact like, heightened experience that you might get from a high stakes story. So yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's interesting to me. What about you, Hannah?
I rate on enjoyment, so that across the board is the same. But I have found that if you watch like my end of the year favorites video, one year I did a separate one for romance, but even if more than half of what I read was romance that year and I combine the two like I did last year, you'll see romance taking up a smaller percentage than you would think on my favorites of the year. So I think oftentimes my 5 stars for romance aren't the same level of 5 stars. You know what I'm saying? That doesn't, I get, there's a lot less all-time favorites. And I don't know why that is. I mean, part of it I know is because when I'm reading romance, I'm often reading it because I don't have to think as much, right? Uh, and I don't mean that as an insult to romance at all. I think that it takes incredible talent to write these stories that allow a reader to just float away and listen and be there for it. I mean that takes incredible talent. And there are romances too that bring more to it as well beyond that. But I give away a lot of 5 stars to romances and a lot of 4 and 3 stars too. I would give more 3 stars to romance than I do fantasy, I would say, and sci-fi and horror. So yeah, it's interesting. I think that I will have more of I will have less romance than you would think based on the percentage on my like favorites of the year or my favorites of all time. But I give away a lot of 5 stars because I rate on enjoyment. So but I think it's that thing that makes it stick in your head that is I think can be missing from a lot of romance books I've given 5 stars. Yes, I had 5-star enjoyment, but did I really remember it 6 months later?
That's something as well that I've definitely noticed. And why there'll be like a rating that I might give something now. And then if I look back on it in 6 months' time, I will then review my ratings. I've done this a few times where I've looked back on ratings that I've given books and I've upped them or decreased them depending on how much longevity they've had over time. Like I think Kindred by Octavia Butler, I originally gave that 4 stars. But then I just kept thinking about it. I just couldn't stop thinking about it. So then I was like, this book has obviously stuck with me. It's made me think. I did enjoy it when I read it, but actually that longevity has meant like upped it to 5. And then there are other ones where I've given it a higher rating, but actually I can't remember them. So it can't really have been a 5-star book. It's probably a 4.
Yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about. I love Kindred, by the way. And I also think that's amazing, by the way, just a side note that you connected to the book and it made you think, especially considering it's set in the US or it's US historical. And so I'm always curious, like, how do those kind of books land for people who are not in the US? But
I think in some ways I was thinking about it in reverse because she's going back into her history and realizing that she has both Black and white heritage, but she looks Black in modern society, whereas I can do the same going back to that many years. And so then you're like, oh, I'd sort of like be the reverse of that. If that experience happened to me, if I went back in time, I would have the reverse experience to her. So it made me think about those things, that I would be able to meet my heritage, but it would be a very different experience to what she had.
That's fascinating. That's a really interesting point.
So it made me think quite a lot.
I love that. Yeah. I love that book so much. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. So we got a question here. Abby, is there a trend with novels that end up in your 3 to 4-star range? Or are those stories just less satisfying in some way? Is it more like there's something about it that's just holding me back from the 5-star feeling? I mean, it's a feeling thing, right?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the times because of rating with enjoyment that 5 stars they just have to have like that magic something. And it's hard to put a finger on exactly what that magic something is, that you can read a book and give it 4 stars and go, there's all these elements and they were all really good. And I don't really know what the fault is in this, but it didn't have that pinch of magic that I needed for it to be 5 stars. I think now, as well as I'm reading through some of the older books on my TBR, that there are definitely some younger books and there's absolutely nothing wrong with them, but I've just moved on from that YA demographic. And so a lot of them are ending up being sort of a 3-star because they don't have the same, depth, the same sort of intense world building and depth that I now gravitate more towards. And that generally, I think with YA is quite fast paced and more surface level. And I guess where I am in life, my experiences are now quite different. And so then there's less things that I connect with in them. But I think like 4-star books are very good books, that it just didn't have that magic of a 5-star.
Yeah, that's well said. And it's interesting too, because I know from watching your channel, it's really interesting noticing how some books that are marketed as YA in the US are marketed as adult in the UK or vice versa. Some books that are marketed as adult here are marketed as YA where you live. Have you figured out any rhyme or reason to this formula?
I think some of it can be to do with like which publisher has got the rights to the book. So like if in the UK Orbit have the rights, then it's going to be an adult book because Orbit publishes adult. Whereas it might not be with Orbit in the US, it might be with, I don't know, Harper Teen or something. And then they're marketing it as YA, whereas over here it's only got the adult publisher behind it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Or Barnes & Noble will put a table of YA books right there next to the regular adult fantasy section and trick you as they did to me. Yeah. Yeah, it's just, I've wanted to do a video about this topic forever, about YA and some thoughts on that, but I have not
Because
gotten
I
to
did
it.
a video on it like a good while ago now, I think, with like examples of books that were marketed in different places at the time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, because I think like the Queens of Renthia, right? That series I think is marketed as adult in the US, and I believe you said it was marketed as YA in the UK, possibly.
Potentially.
Yeah. Which, by the way, magical forest setting, Hannah. So
Oh,
maybe,
really?
yeah.
Yeah, very foresty.
Oh, wait, Renthia.
Sarah Beth Durst,
That's
have
the
you read
Sarah
it?
Beth series. I own
Yeah.
that whole trilogy.
You got to read it.
I
Very
know.
whimsical,
It's
magical
kind of
fantasy.
magical and it's witchy too, right?
Not necessarily witchy. I mean, it's a queendom. So it's a queendom set fantasy story.
And which
And
is the one that focuses the mother? One of them has a
the
mother as a
second
main.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The Reluctant Queen has a female protagonist who is a mother character with two small children. She's in a less than ideal marriage. And yeah, she's reluctant to take on a certain position of leadership. It's really good. That character, Naylin, fantastic character. Fantastic character.
That's been on my TBR for a long time. It's staring at me.
Maybe it needs
As are
to
so many others.
That's
sneak
the
up
best
that
book in the
TBR.
series, in my opinion, too. I don't know. I like book 1 a lot, but I loved Naylin in book 2. Book 3 is not as strong, I thought, but yeah, still worth reading, especially if you love a good whimsical forest setting. For
I
sure.
do.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Well, we are just past the hour and a half mark right now. Just going to look really quickly into, correct me, I think YA covers have an eye candy effect, Heaven Breaker, all their own that is not seen in regular speculative fiction. Yeah, I mean, there certainly are differences in the covers of the stories and how they're marketed. That's a really good point. And I've often heard that authors don't necessarily get a say in what kind of cover that they have, like the publisher's in charge of that. So that can affect things. But definitely, I mean, I think you can identify a YA book sometimes by the cover.
And then there are ones that are misleading. Like I think, what was it, Firekeeper's Daughter that came out a few years ago? The cover makes it look more like a fantasy, but it's not.
Oh, really? Interesting.
That was like a YA thriller. But
Oh,
based on the way it looks like it could be a fantasy.
oh, that's
I
too
thought that
bad.
was fancy.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting just the different marketing choices and how that affects books. I think the one thing that I find so interesting about the whole YA versus adult thing is that it's just the coming of age aspect of it. So that's a point of view that I'm really curious to look into more in depth because usually if it's a male coming of age story like Robin Hobb's Farseer trilogy, it's adult. If it's a female coming of age story, then oftentimes it's considered YA. And even if the ages of the characters are the same, but I think part of that might have to do with rite of passages. So, like for example, a male becoming a man usually means what? Killing and maybe having sex for the first time, possibly. But for a woman, what does it mean to come of age for a woman? I feel like that question is a little more ambiguous.
I think it depends too. I mean, I think a lot of YA fantasy is fantasy romance. And so I think that's part of it too, where there's they're starting young and then becoming adults, but I don't think it goes like as far in the future, you know, in their lives. It just kind of covers that like few years or whatnot. But there's definitely a lot of crossover and confusion with the YA situation.
Well, you know, Lisa from Fun Fantasy Books, I had her on Y Read a while back, and she brought up such an interesting insight about this. She said that what's interesting is if you look at a lot of fantasy that's focused on a male character, there's a male that's the chosen one. But a lot of times when a female is the chosen one, it's usually she's chosen by the male. Like that's what makes her chosen. So the romance would be like, oh, like chosen by the man of my dreams. And there is some kind of patriarchal lens to that if you think about it. It's just I thought about it very differently after she brought that up.
Right. Yeah.
It's something we don't really think about very deeply. But.
One of the things that I think can differentiate it as well is like a lot of the times the characters in YA books are sort of they're growing up, aren't they? They're sort of trying to find their place in the world and sort of find their feet, and they're going on a journey in that book to like find whether it's a contemporary or a fantasy that they're trying to find their way in life. Whereas more so in adults, you've got characters that know who they are as people, and they're not necessarily trying to find themselves. Some of the time they are, but it's more like they know their direction. They know who they are as a person, and then you have them discovering other things. Like YA, they're discovering like they might have magic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, and I agree with that. I feel like the themes of a YA story might be different than a adult story for sure. But I'm mostly just thinking about the coming of age arc and how, like, for example, I mean, I know there are more examples of what I'm thinking about right now, but Farseer being the number one thing I think about, like, why is that considered adult? Whereas even Mistborn with the book one is considered YA, and it does become more adult, I guess, as it goes on.
I feel like that was just always been shelved in adult in the UK.
Yeah. I feel like if it, and maybe this is too strong a statement, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like if it were a male character, if Vin were male, I feel like there would be no doubt. Like people would just call it all adult.
Or if it was written by a female author, it would have just been put in YA.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
I feel like the Skyward series and the Mistborn series read the same to me in terms of, and not that I mean, I should say Mistborn 1 and Skyward 1. That's the first book, right? Skyward. They read the same for age range, in my opinion. And it's not that she doesn't really age much throughout that. In fact, I DNF'd the third book because I got so annoyed with the teenage love situation.
In Skyward or
the third Mistborn?
Oh, in Mistborn. Oh, okay.
Yeah, the series went, for me personally, I know it's an unpopular opinion, that the series went downhill. I gave the first book 5 stars, the second book 3 stars, and then DNF'd the third book. My husband filled me in on everything that happened. So I'm good. But I had him just tell me because I tried repeatedly and I just couldn't get over the couple. And just it felt very YA to me. So I totally agree. There are certain ones that I do think that if someone else had written that series, it would have been a YA series. I think if it had been a woman that had written the Mistborn series, it would have been put in YA.
Yeah. I mean, I can't help but think that. It's just my own biased opinion.
And I see a lot of conversations with female adult epic fantasy authors and confusion over, oh, I thought that was YA. That happens all of the time, or their store associates put them in the YA section. It happens with David Bad. It happens with the Jasmine Throne. It happens especially, I find, with BIPOC female adult fantasy authors. That there's always this confusion over whether or not they're YA. And I'm like, why would that be YA? Like, I don't understand why you would think that was YA, you know?
Yeah. It's
and meanwhile, there's fantasy. Sorry.
I was going to say, I guess that's when you end up with authors initializing so that they have that ambiguity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it's the weirdest thing. You have these adult or new adult fantasy romance books that often to me read as YA, but you don't have as much of that issue with the self-pub world. Oftentimes, if there's a YA fantasy romance, most people don't realize it's YA fantasy romance until they read it and there wasn't enough smut, in it, and they're like, "Oh, 'cause it was YA." So you don't have that with the self-pub fantasy romance world.
Yeah, I feel like self-pub is its own game right now, and they're kind of defining those rules a little bit more. Whereas in traditional publishing, it's just something that I question a lot, and I'm sure there are changes that are happening, but I just can't help but see these patterns and trends sometimes. And so
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
I
thank
think
you.
I think in some ways it's also hard because obviously we're coming into it, and if we do read YA, we're not the target audience. That YA is what, 12 to 16, 18, and that's still a very large range. Like a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old will be interested in reading very different things and probably shouldn't be reading the same things. But I think we've progressed a lot from when I was a teenager. Like I remember my local bookshop growing up had a very small section. So we've come a long way to where we are today with things.
that's true. And I mean, growing up for me, there was like very little YA at all. Especially there was like no fantasy YA at all. So I feel like we've come a long way with that. And I actually like seeing a lot of YA. I think that's a positive thing. The other challenge about that though too is apparently according to a lot of literary statistics, the majority of people who read YA are adults. And then there could be a mix with, okay, we're marketing this YA, but we're really having an adult in mind. And then sometimes it is very young, and then the adults read it. And so it's kind of all blurred at that point. It
Right.
gets very blurred, in my opinion.
Because if you're marketing it towards adult readers, then it's sort of in the wrong place.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
But then I guess one of the benefits is that you just want people to be reading. Like
100%. Yes.
yeah,
That's
whatever
the
they're reading, it's good that more and more people have been picking up books.
Oh,
Whether
yeah,
it's
yeah. And
whatever
no
genre.
judgment at all for anyone who reads YA. I've enjoyed a lot of YA as an adult. I don't think there's anything I have no judgment about that, but I just find the blurring interesting, and then the questions that arise from that really interesting too.
Mhm.
Especially if it's not just adult readers, but it's also targeting females specifically. And so there can be almost this perception that, again, like if you're a female author or reader, you're YA. And there, as much as I say, like no judgment of YA, I feel like a lot of people will still associate YA with certain tropes or certain conventions or a certain more simple approach to writing. So it's so complex. It's
The
so
other thing
amazing.
is, like, if you look at the YA authors, I don't know that many that are male.
No.
But you have some male authors in middle grade, like Rick Riordan, although it's not a demographic that I read from that much, so I don't know much about that as a demographic of books. And then you get a lot of males that write adult fantasy, but I feel as though if you look at the YA section, it's very heavily female.
Yeah, and statistically, the majority of readers in younger age groups are female. That we don't have as many male readers in younger ages.
And is it that they don't have what they would want?
What would they have? I've gone into the YA section of Barnes& and Noble trying to think for a male young adult or a male teenager or a male middle grade. Middle grade's a little easier, I think, but specifically YA.
That a lot
Hard.
of them would skip from probably that Percy Jackson to
Yes.
Mistborn.
Like, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So man, I wish we could go on and on about this because I love this topic so much, but I know that we do need to go ahead and get going because I know Hannah has some kids in the background here. So,
I
we're
can
gonna
hear him.
go
Like that room is only going to stay contained for so much longer.
Yeah. And I did hold you all a little over than what I said I would too. So I appreciate you sticking around for this discussion, which is so fascinating to me. So I first
Thank you for
also
having
wanted,
us.
yeah, I before we leave, can I ask you all anything that we can expect from your channels moving forward for the rest of the year? Any kind of specific content or specific series that you'll be covering?
I usually have a readathon to talk about, but oh, well, no, that's not mine, so I can't. There will be an announcement for something I'm co-hosting coming up.
Okay.
So you can mark your calendars in September, but that's not mine, so I can't say anything else. But other than that, my channel is just when I post, which is every 3 to 7-ish days, maybe, and just the regular stuff. Nothing else, I don't think right now, but
Okay.
I'll be here.
Well, then we'll keep an eye out for whatever readathon you're going to be co-hosting and announcing. So thanks. What about you, Abby?
Okay. Consistently, sort of mostly consistent on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. UK. But in terms of content, I'm working on reading my subscribers' recommendations as a video. So I've been working on that. I need to read one more book and then it'll be complete. Well, I'll have to edit it and that'll probably take an age. But I also would like to get my Rhythm of War vlog up because I have done a series of reading that's on my archive and vlogging that. So I do need to finish reading it and then vlog it. So that should come some point later this year. But I don't really plan like too far in advance really with what content I'm doing, apart from the staples, that there'll be like a wrap-up TBR series check-in every quarter. And in terms of what I'm reading, it's a whole mixture of what's on my TBR, hopefully. I've been working my way through the Veronica Speedwell series, so I'm about halfway through that one, so continuing with that. And I'm going to be starting Magician by Raymond D. Feist tomorrow, so we'll see how that one goes.
Janie Wirtz co-wrote the subsequent series to that. And I've heard fantastic things about Daughter of the Empire. I've heard that the female character in that trilogy is outstanding. So if you bounce off Magician, maybe give that one a try.
I've heard that Magician, it could go either way because obviously it's quite an old book, but I've heard amazing things about Daughter of the Empire, and I was like, even if I don't like Magician, I should still give that one a try.
Yeah, I would definitely give it a try. I would read it myself if I weren't in the middle of her 11-book series right now. But yeah, I've heard she's like one of the best female characters in fantasy.
I've heard that one's really good. So I think those are some ideas of what's coming up. But
and I saw Warlord on your TBR, by the way.
Oh, I haven't got to that.
Yeah, so I was just going to tell you really quickly because that's one of my favorite trilogies that I would give it all the way till the end of book 1 because there's a rough lot of exposition in the beginning of book 1. It's not an easy read at first, and then at the end is when it starts to pick up and really get going. But if you don't like it at the end, then maybe it won't be for you, but I would just push through to the end if you're struggling at the beginning. So.
Okay, yeah, because that one has been on my TBR a few times and I haven't got to it yet, but I will do.
I love it. I love it though. It's so good. All right, well, that's it for now. So please stay tuned to both these channels. They're both linked in the description below. Subscribe to both of them. Check out their wonderful content. And we love talking with you in the chat. We also love talking with you in the comment section for the replay if you're watching this late. So thank you all so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. I think that's ending now.